Hello everyone and welcome back to another list video talking about my most disappointing releases of 2019, 25 to be precise. I know that some people are probably going to dislike me for some of these choices. They might be like, oh, how did you not like this album? But honestly, it's not just about albums that I didn't like or I didn't enjoy. Instead, there are lots of albums on this list that I do like and I do enjoy, and I do recommend to some of you to listen to them. They might be more to your liking. However, it's about those albums where I expected a bit more out of them and I didn't really got that much of the full package. It's albums that are not going to be in my top 50 list with my favorite albums of the year or in my honorable mentions of the year, and there are some albums that I don't like, but none of them is going to be in my video with my 10 worst albums of the year. So with that being said, let's get into 7 honorable mentions in this occasion, starting with Sea of Worry by Have a Nice Life. Never was I the hugest fan of Have a Nice Life. I think that the album Death Consciousness is a really good one, and I see why people really like this album. On the other hand, this one, it had some really good elements. There are 2 tracks in this album that I really like. However, the main issue with this album is with its whole sound, the production on this thing. It sounds really muddy. I really don't like the sound of this album in general. It's definitely the thing that drags it down the most. Also, I never was a huge fan of Black Marble, even though I thought that some of their previous works were quite decent. However, Bigger Than Life was definitely my hugest disappointment, an album that was average at best. On the other hand, I've pretty much loved all of the works of Pharmakon, but this one has to be my least favorite one. The reason why this is not higher on the list is because the album is actually quite decent. I like the album, but definitely compared to some of your previous works, this one sort of feels like she's going into kind of the same direction. There's not that much changing in her sound. I would like something different in the next project. Flying Lotus is an artist where I see a bit of a downgrade in some of his later works. I don't really enjoy some of the later stuff he has done, and this brand new album over here is definitely the weakest one I've heard from him so far. Gotchi had an album on 2018 that I enjoyed a lot. However, this one seems to go a bit more into just bubblegum bass, and there are some nice ideas. The production to this is nice, it's quite colorful and catchy, but still there is not the energy and some of the colorful elements in some of his previous projects. Didn't really enjoy this as much. Have you seen anyone actually talk about this album? This one just flew off the radar, and that's mainly because this is just another Amon Amarth album. They don't do something different, it's just the same thing. They just recycle the sound once again. Nothing really special about it. And my final mention is the self-titled album by the Brian Jonestown Massacre. I think they have some really good works in their career, but they have a really long discography, and some of their later ones going to do just some more standard neo-psychedelia sound. It's just stuff that we've heard a lot, and this album just adds nothing new to the table whatsoever. And now getting into my 25 albums, we start with Disco Anaxiete by She Passed Away. I liked the 2 previous albums from She Passed Away, but this one seems to go a bit more into the electronic side of things. It's more synth pop oriented, and it's one of those occasions where I prefer their more rock and post-punk stuff. This new direction didn't work that well for them in my opinion. Horror released their most underwhelming project so far, really short, feeling kind of rushed and unfinished. It's really underwhelming, there could have been far more to it. The reason why this album is not higher is because I'm at this point where I don't really care for what Logic releases. I mean, this album is not as bad as the garbage one Supermarket that he released the same year. However, as rap standard goes, This has definitely his worst bars, his worst lyrical content, and some of the most bland and generic trap instrumentals he has used so far. Rico Nasty and Kenny Beats are two really interesting names, and this collaboration could have been far better, but what we get is a really short album that lacks of substance. It is just not that much fulfilling. There could have been far more to it. With the names included in this collaboration, I was super excited. However, the final result is one of the most uninteresting and one of the most forgettable free improvisation albums I've heard all year. That was a disappointment in my opinion. Even though this album has gotten some really good critics, for me it's the weakest work from La Dispute. Like taking some of their previous stuff, this is just average in my opinion. Really not doing that much of a justice with their sound compared to their previous stuff. Never was the hugest fan of Matmos, but taking the concept of this album and that it's made by just recordings of plastic objects, it really caught my attention. I think it's an interesting idea, but the final result is not as great as I would expect. I thought that this was another quite underwhelming work from Matmos. There could have been far more to it in my opinion. The new album from Deathspell Omega has some elements that I quite like, but it's about those elements that seems to take them back into their older sound. They have gotten into another direction that in my opinion it doesn't work that much with their sound. You know, I give it to this album that it has some of the most unique ideas I've heard in a black metal album all year, and I actually want to see them push forward with this sound because I'm pretty sure that they can just make something far better, that this is just the beginning of a new direction in their sound. What we got, in my opinion, it could have been better, but I'm definitely looking forward to more. This album got me excited while listening to some of the first teaser tracks, but listening to some of the other teaser tracks towards the release of the album and getting the final result, we got a really sort of one-dimensional and repetitive album that has some nice atmospheres to it, but as a full thing it was a bit boring and it just makes you want to go to sleep. Alberich is a big name in the underground scene of power noise and just death industrial music, and this brand new release was quite disappointing with some of the most empty and forgettable ideas in an underground album I've heard all year. This was sad. I definitely had high expectations for this. Even more disappointing in the underground scene was the brand new release of Trepaneric Ritualen in my opinion. This one was even more empty. There was almost nothing to it in terms of sound. I get that he tried to attempt something different, getting into some more ritual stuff, but his whole approach just makes it one of the most forgettable albums I've heard all year. Night Lovell seemed to be one of the most promising rappers in the cloud rap scene, and then he releases one of the most generic and one of the most repetitive and one-dimensional albums I've heard all year. I like the previous works from Black Banshee and everything was building up into something better and better, but Metamorphosis was a huge downgrade and letdown, leading into sort of a big single that is just separated into lots of small portions where they don't feel like they're that well connected at all, and just having some really bland sounds of new age and ambient that really don't sound all that great or capture a nice aesthetic or a feel to it. Really didn't enjoy this as much as I would like to. As far as I'm not the hugest fan of Brockhampton, especially with some of their later stuff, I thought that maybe Kevin Abstract would do something different, something better, but instead what we got with this brand new release is a painfully average album with some really annoying auto-tune vocals and some really weak instrumentals. Even if lyrically is a quite personal and a really heartfelt album, with pretty much else is almost unlistenable in some occasions. Now getting into my top 10. we have the brand new mixtape of Ocean Wisdom. I think this is his weakest project so far. The dude still proves that he can spit bars, he can rhyme, he's an impressive rapper, but I think that we get some of the weakest efforts in terms of production and sound, and an album filled with a lot of filler. He usually makes really long albums, but this is definitely the occasion where this one in particular needed to be a bit shorter. This collaboration of Merzbow, Kezi Haino and Palash Pandi was something that I was anticipating, given the fact that I was a fan of their previous work. I thought it was quite good. This one though, not as much. Really didn't like the free improvised elements, really didn't enjoy the directions they took with their sound, and I didn't really find that much of a great balance with the musicians on this thing. Madonna's brand new album is one of the most disappointing releases she has done so far. The thing that saves this album is the fact that some of the deeper cuts were actually quite decent, but this album has easily the weakest set of singles out of any album from Madonna so far. Going to this more approachable sound of R&B and trap music, it made for an album that was really generic, no one talked about, and it's one of those occasions where we have a Madonna album that doesn't reinvent well and no one is actually talking about it. That's because it has nothing new to offer. Irse by Croatian Amor was one of the first disappointments I got from this year. I really loved some of the very first works from Croatian Amor, but getting more and more into this sort of ambient pop and deconstructed club and IDM sound, I don't really think it fits his sound and his aesthetic all that much, but you know, whatever. Never would I thought there would be this day where I would be disappointed by an album of Chelsea Wolfe, but this is that day. This was a really average gothic folk album of Chelsea Wolfe. Her performances and her sound are magical, but this album was just quite boring and forgettable. Jesse Felstein made one of the most aggressive and one of the darkest releases in the mainstream techno scene with his debut, and then he released Hyperion, which was a huge disappointment, probably for a lot of people, since he went into a more synth-pop oriented side with some R&B, having some really bad features, and pretty much missing anything that made Gesaffelstein's sound appealing in the first place. I've loved pretty much anything Baby Metal have released so far, and as far as I can say that this sounds like their most mature work so far and their most professional, coming to some of the ideas and the sounds, it's the least fun album. I just love the really catchy and silly attitude of the previous two albums, which is something that sort of misses right there, and I got really disappointed with this one. I definitely wanted to like this more. This is an album where a lot of people disagreed with my opinion. It's possibly my most disliked video so far, and I'm talking about Magdalene by FKA Twigs. For me, this album was a disappointment. I get that for a lot of people their main concern was that I didn't give that much of an emphasis into the lyrics, which yeah, it's something that I didn't really do, and I get that lyrically is a quite personal album and it's quite devastating, talking about some of her struggles in her personal life. But musically, this album didn't manage to resonate with me and just make me feel all of those really dark emotions. Even though I can tell that this album is darker and more sad and more chaotic than her debut, which was a bit more uplifting and catchy. Some of the elements with the singing and the instrumentals just felt really empty, and no matter how many times I listened to this album, it still hasn't resonated with me. I don't really like this comeback from FKA Twigs. Number 2 is Sexorcism by Brooke Candy, an album that I was really hyped for after listening to some of the main singles, which I thought were really catchy, and I really liked this whole sexy and nasty attitude. But what we get with the full album is a really trashy pop rap experience that at the end of the day it tries so hard to be edgy and just over sexualized. And it's quite sad because there are tracks that I truly like, but the features on this thing and Brooke Caddy herself don't have that much great deliveries, and even musically wise this album was really weak in production. And number one on my biggest disappointment of this year is something that, if you know me, if you have seen my reviews, you've probably expected at this point, but yeah, it's K12 by Melanie Martinez. You know, I was actually a huge fan of the very first album from Melanie Martinez, Cry Baby, and I still am up until this day. I would say that it's one of my favorite pop albums of this decade. But the main problem with K12 is that it pretty much had everything I was afraid of by getting into a brand new release of Melanie Martinez. Pretty much every fear I had for this album came true. This is a really bland and average indie pop album that just tries so hard to be edgy. And the very first album had some really forward-thinking tracks, especially with its sound and its production. And even lyrically, I liked how it dealt with so many life concepts, whereas in the case of K12, it goes into a specific theme, everything surrounded about school stuff, and it just tries so hard to just put every single edgy thing one upon the other on just this specific topic, and in some of the occasions it doesn't really work that well. This album is also associated with a really average movie where the main thing that is enjoyable about this movie is actually the whole visuals, the aesthetic, and the choreographies, because anything else about this movie was not great. It had some of the worst acting I've seen in a movie all year, and it had an almost non-existent plot that didn't really lead up to anything. It had so many plot holes, the story was just going from one thing to the next without that much of a balance or a rhyme or a reason, and so this makes for both an average movie and an average album, and that's really sad. And that's all I have to say. What's your disappointments of this year? Let me know down in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.